Everyone's got a story. What's yours? We all live in stories, and we all live on stories. Stories of quests for truth and seeking to right wrongs. Stories of fearsome monsters and facing up to them together. Stories of our lives and stories of this world we live in. Is your story a hopeful story? We think it can be.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the second event of Story. We're so glad that you're tuning in. I'm Carrie, and I'm a third year at St. John's College, and I'll be hosting you this evening, or whatever time it is where you are. I know for our speaker, it's currently the middle of the afternoon. If you're new to Story, a really warm welcome to you. Story is a whole host of opportunities over the course of 2 weeks and more, where we're thinking about the stories of our lives and the world around us, and most importantly, how the story of Jesus might have something to say to each and every one of these stories. Our theme tonight is a story for the hurting, and the question we'll be looking at is, where is God in our anxiety and pain? Helping us to think about this question is Rebecca McLaughlin. Rebecca is a Cambridge alumnus and an author who spent loads of time investigating and researching into some of the toughest objections to the Christian faith. So we're really excited to hear from her. Later on, we're also getting a chance to hear from a fellow Cambridge student who will be sharing with us her personal experience with mental health and faith and her perspectives on this question. Throughout the evening, there'll also be a great opportunity for you to ask your questions to Rebecca through our Pigeonhole app, which will be embedded right at the side of this video on our website, storycambridge.uk. So you can just go there and type in your questions. You can submit them with your name or anonymously, and we'll be asking Rebecca your questions live at the end of this event. But first up, let's hear what Rebecca has to say to this question: where is God in our anxiety and pain?
Great to be with you all today. I'm calling in from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which I like to call New Cambridge because it's in New England, so it really should be New Cambridge. But I spent 7 happy, or mostly happy, 7 mixedly, sometimes happy, sometimes unhappy years in wonderful, proper, real Cambridge, where you guys either are physically or virtually right now. So it's a real treat to me to be talking with you today and talking about the questions of where is God in our anxiety and pain. Now, right before COVID hit last year, I went to visit a small college in Oregon in America. And I was speaking there, and I heard a really interesting story while I was there about a student who a few years before, she was a psychology student, and she got this tattoo on her leg, a photo of which had gone viral. The tattoo was designed so that if you were looking at her, it read, "I'm fine." But if she was looking down at the message on her leg, it said, "Save me." Now, I doubt many of us in this virtual room today have a tattoo. If our actual feelings were tattooed onto our bodies, my guess is that for some, that interface between "I'm fine" and "save me" would be about where we're at. "I'm fine" is what we project to the world, but inside, we're not always fine. Some of us are hanging on by a fraying thread, and our question today is, where on earth is God in all of that? For some, that will be a question that's sort of hovering in your peripheral vision. You believe God exists, maybe you even identify as a Christian. Honestly, you feel like you've been crying out to God in your anxiety and pain, and he hasn't answered. For others, that question is the biggest reason why you don't believe in God. How could a loving God allow the suffering that we see in this world? How could he allow the pain that you've experienced in your life? How could there be a God, as Christians claim, who is both infinitely good and infinitely powerful, and yet allow his creatures to suffer as we do? Today, I want to look at these questions through two different lenses, the lens of atheism and the lens of Christianity. Now, you may ask why those two with all the different belief systems in the world, and the answer is this: Christianity is the most widespread and the most diverse belief system in the world today. Almost a third, about 31% of all humans identify as Christian. And that proportion isn't shrinking, actually, it's growing. In global terms, the main competitor to Christianity numbers-wise isn't atheism or agnosticism or general non-belief, it's Islam. But in the West, some form of non-theism is seen as the most credible alternative to Christianity. While only a fairly small proportion of people would identify as atheists, a growing proportion actually identify as non-religious of one kind or another. And honestly, when you poke non-religiousness and ask it to be really honest with itself, it's betting on the fact that there is no God. At least not the kind of personal God who cares about your suffering or mine. So in our time today, we're going to do that weird thing that opticians do. I don't know if you have glasses or contact lenses like I have. That weird thing of asking us if something looks better through this lens or that one, this one or that one. And we're going to do that looking through the lens of Christianity and atheism. Is it better with this one or that one? So let's start with atheism. If there is no God, then some of our problems are solved. We don't need to wonder why he hasn't seemed to answer our cries for help. We don't need to worry about how he could be loving and powerful and still let people suffer. We still suffer. And when we take God out of the equation, we lose all hope that our suffering might matter in the end, that our lives might mean something, that our anxiety might one day be relieved, and that somebody might ultimately care. I remember a few years ago, I was walking with a friend through a season of great pain and depression. She'd grown up in a very observant Jewish family in the US and had turned away from her childhood faith as an undergrad. She was experimenting with Buddhist meditation, but honestly didn't believe in God. And at one point we were sitting by the river together, and she said, despite everything, that maybe the universe had a plan for her life. And I had to gently remind her that if there is no God, there is no cosmic plan. As famous atheist Richard Dawkins puts it, the universe has precisely the properties we would expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. My friend was reaching for the placebo to dull the pain, wondering if the universe had a plan for her life. But if there is no God, talk of the universe having a plan is just that, a placebo. And placebos only work if you don't know what they are. You see, if there is no God, we actually lose far more than we realize. We don't get a better story where we're on the right side of history and everything will come right in the end. We get a set of meaningless words. We don't get a better chance at universal justice and equality. We get a world in which, as atheist historian Yuval Noah Harari puts it in his global bestseller, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, we get a world in which Homo sapiens have no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders have no natural rights. We get a world in which, as agnostic physicist and MIT professor Alan Lightman puts it, MIT is just down the street from me here, our consciousness and our self-awareness create an illusion that we are made of some special substance, that we have some kind of special ego power, some I-ness, some unique existence, when in reality we are nothing but bones, tissues, gelatinous membranes, electrical impulses, and chemicals. That's you and me seen through the lens of atheism. Our suffering doesn't matter. It's nothing more than electrical impulses creating the illusion of a thing called pain. With this reality, it's desperately sad, but it's perhaps not surprising that people who never attend religious services are as much as 5 times as likely to kill themselves as those who go to church every week. It's not surprising that people who are non-religious are significantly more likely to experience depression. These things can absolutely strike Christians too. In fact, some of the greatest Christian leaders in history have suffered at times from debilitating depression, and not for a moment saying that following Jesus suddenly makes life easy. We'll come to that in a minute. Knowing that your life has no meaning, that your depression or anxiety are just pointless neural firings, that you're not fine, there is no fine to be because there's no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That is what we see when we look through the lens of atheism. So what happens when we switch the lens and look at suffering in light of Christianity? Do all our problems disappear? Like Mary Poppins going around the room of our lives and clicking her fingers to tidy everything up? Not at all. Where some religious frameworks promise us escape from suffering by dissociating ourselves from the mess of this world, Jesus does the opposite. He says that anyone who wants to follow him must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow him. The call of Jesus is a call to come and die. But after saying that, Jesus made this enigmatic claim. He said, for whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. To see what this means in practice, I want to walk through one of my favorite chapters in the entire Bible. It's from John's Gospel, one of the 4 New Testament accounts of Jesus's life. And if you want to read it for yourself afterwards, which I strongly recommend to you, it's in John chapter 11. And we know from Luke's Gospel that Jesus was good friends with 2 sisters called Mary and Martha. And in this chapter, in John chapter 11, Mary and Martha's beloved brother Lazarus is very ill. But Mary and Martha aren't fazed. They know the greatest healer in town. So they send a message to Jesus. Lord, they say, the one you love is ill. Notice that, not Lazarus is ill, but the one you love. And then in verse 5, John emphasizes this again. He says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Do you see how strange that statement is? It would make sense if he'd said, now Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus, so he came right away. It would make sense if it said, Jesus didn't much care about Mary and Martha and Lazarus, and he was much too busy anyway, so he didn't come. But John tells us that Jesus loved them, and so he didn't come. In fact, Jesus deliberately waited until Lazarus was dead, and then he came. A few years ago, I went through a season of intense psychological distress. No one had died, but I'd lost a relationship that was very precious to me, and I was devastated. Being British, I'm not big on crying, but my husband saw me cry more in the space of a month than he'd seen me cry in the previous 10 years that he'd known me. And one day after we'd put the kids to bed, I was sitting on the sofa crying again. And Brian came and sat with me, and he tried reading the Bible to me. He read to me from one of the Psalms in the Old Testament, sort of the Old Testament hymn book, Psalm 121, and it begins like this. I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. But as Brian read, I just cried more. And I explained to my poor confused husband, I feel like I'm crying out to the Lord and he is not helping me. Perhaps you felt that way. Maybe you're not even sure if you believe in God, but sometimes in distress, you've tried to pray and you've heard nothing back. That's how Mary and Martha felt at this moment in the story. They'd cried out to Jesus for help and he hadn't come. But that's not the end of the story. Once Lazarus is safely dead and buried, Jesus came. Martha came out to meet him and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. Do you see this woman's faith? Lazarus is dead. And even now, she has faith to believe that Jesus will heal him. So does Jesus go and heal Lazarus now? No. He replies, your brother will rise again. Both Jesus and Martha were Jewish, and many Jews in the first century believed that at the end of time, God would raise his people from the dead. So Martha replies, I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. But that's no help to her now. You can almost hear her thinking, what about now, Jesus? What about now? Why won't you help me now? And Jesus looks into the eyes of this grieving, desperate woman, and he says some of the most famous words in the entire Bible. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even though he die, yet shall he live. And anyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Martha thinks that her greatest need is to have Lazarus back. But Jesus says her greatest need is him. He's not a means to an end. He is the end. He is the resurrection and the life, and nothing else matters compared to him. If that is not true, then Jesus isn't a good moral teacher. He's a fraud. If it is true, then no matter what else is happening in your life today, no matter how you're hurting, no matter how anxious or depressed you are, what you most need is not for your problems to go away. It's Jesus. Martha responds, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Then the story goes on. Martha calls her sister Mary, and Mary comes out and falls at Jesus' feet, saying, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw Mary weeping at his feet, he was deeply moved. And he asked, where have you laid him? So they take Jesus to the tomb, and then we read one of the shortest and most surprising verses in the Bible. Jesus wept. Why is Jesus weeping? We know that he let Lazarus die on purpose. We know from other accounts in the Gospels that Jesus didn't even have to be there to heal someone. He could just have clicked his fingers at a distance, like Mary Poppins cleaning up, and Lazarus would have been well again. The onlookers notice this as well. When they see Jesus crying, some say, look how he loved him. Other people say, couldn't he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Yes. So why is Jesus weeping? In this moment, we see that God does not stand at a distance from our suffering, waiting until we learn our lessons. It's not that our suffering doesn't matter to him. It matters enough to bring tears to the eyes of the Son of God. In fact, the Bible presents suffering as the place of special intimacy with Jesus because Jesus suffered more than anyone else. You see, at the very heart of the Christian faith lies this strange claim that the Creator God himself became human in the person of Jesus, and that he did this so that he could die on a cross to save people like me, like you. For most great leaders, public, painful, shameful execution is not their goal in life. For Jesus, it was. The reality of suffering isn't an embarrassment to the Christian faith, as if Christianity is meant for shiny, happy people who don't have any problems. But the brutal suffering of an innocent man is staked right at the heart of Christianity. And at this moment in John's Gospel, we see this man, Jesus, weeping with his friends in the depths of their pain. If you are suffering today, Jesus is reaching out to you. I am the resurrection and the life, he says. Whatever you're going through, bring it to me. My arms are open wide for you. I'm ready to meet with you and weep with you in your pain. But again, this isn't the end of the story. You see, if Jesus was only loving and compassionate, that wouldn't be enough. We'd have a friend in suffering, but at the end of the day, we still wouldn't have hope. But we see in the final move of the story that Jesus isn't only loving, he's also incredibly, unbelievably strong. In those days, people were often buried in cave tombs covered by a stone. Jesus tells them to take the stone of Lazarus's tomb away. Martha points out the embarrassing fact that Lazarus's body will be rotting by now. Lord, by this time, she says, there will be an odor, for he has been dead for 4 days. But Jesus insists. And after praying, he cries out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the man who had died, John says, came out. Do you see who Jesus is? He is the one man who can call us out of our graves. My kids are 10, 8, and 2, and whenever we drive past a graveyard, I tell them this story. I tell them that one day, when they are dead and buried and their bodies have rotted away, Jesus will come back. And if they have put their trust in him, he will call them out of their graves. Miranda, come out. Eliza, come out. Luke, come out. And when that day comes, nothing else will matter. No grades they did or didn't get. No relationships they did or didn't have. No glittering success or abject failure, because Jesus is the resurrection and the life. That's all that's going to matter in the end. If their lives are marked by chronic suffering, physical or mental or both, one day he will wipe every tear from their eyes. That student who tattooed, I'm fine, save me, onto her leg wasn't just expressing the desperation of those who suffer from chronic depression and anxiety, trying to pretend that they're fine, when on the inside they're crying out. She was also expressing the choice that each of us has as we face the good and bad of this life. Will we say to the God who made us, I'm fine, I don't need you, thanks very much? Or will we recognize our weakness and cry out to Jesus, save me? It takes great humility to do that. It means admitting we need saving and that we can't save ourselves. It means acknowledging that we're not the good people we pretend to be, and that God does have the right to judge us. But it's also an incredible relief. Because you see, if Jesus is who he says he is, then he is the one person who knows us better than we know ourselves. He sees our fears and struggles and anxieties. He sees our jealousy, our selfishness, our lust. He sees your weakness and mine. He sees my shame and yours. And instead of saying, oh, now that I know you, I don't want you anymore, he says, I know you, and I love you to death on a cross and back again. I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even though he dies, yet shall he live. And anyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?
Thanks so much, Rebecca. That was really helpful. I'm sure that as we were listening to that, loads of questions might have popped into your mind. And so I'd really encourage you to head to our Pigeonhole app and ask Rebecca your questions. So just go to our website and you'll see the app embedded right next to this video, and we'll be asking Rebecca your questions live later on. But first, we're going to hear from Cambridge history student Anna, who was chatting with Wei earlier to share her own experiences of mental health issues as a Christian.
Hey Anna, hello, how are you? Yeah, before we hear a bit of your story, why don't you tell us a bit about who you are and your Cambridge stats as well?
Sure. Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you. It's nice to see you. I'm Anna. I'm a third year and I'm doing history at Selwyn, but not currently at Selwyn, but I'm missing Cambridge a lot. But yeah, nice to join you from home.
Same as many of us, I'm sure. Great. And yeah, I know that for you, what we've been hearing tonight isn't just some abstract concept, but a real part of your story. Could you tell us a bit about your experience of dealing with mental health issues as a Christian, please?
Yeah, sure. So for me, like I've been a Christian from quite a young age, and growing up definitely just had like a real joy in that, and that was great. But when I was about 12, some very difficult situations hit in like school and family and health, and my mental health started to spiral as a result. And yeah, for a few years I had struggles with different kind of intensities of anxiety and depression. And yeah, that was tough, but like God was so present and I could see him working right from the first few months of not knowing what was going on. And then over those few years I came to the point where God had just like led me through and I was completely well, which was amazing. Just completely fine, free of it all. Yeah, and I think like others, COVID has been a more challenging time, but having God with me in that has also been really precious.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, you mentioned how kind of God has been with you in these times. Could you elaborate on that a bit, please?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's so many times where knowing God was just like what kept me afloat and what brought me through. Because, you know, as Christians, we believe that like what the Bible says is true and it's relevant to our lives. So hearing verses like, I know the plans I have for you and they're good and they're not to harm you, they're to prosper you. And it's like, wow, God's got a purpose for like me specifically and he loves me and he created me to be me. That's amazing. And that really was like such a lifeline in those times when I was struggling with my self-worth and my purpose and my identity and struggling with really crippling fears of the future. And actually what Rebecca was sharing about John 11 with Jesus weeping with Mary and Martha and the death of their brother has been such a real part of my relationship with God over the years. I can remember so many times where like in the story, even when God was about to restore things or change things or bring healing or bring freedom, I could still sense like the arms of my Father around me and that God was just like weeping with me in my pain because I'm his child and it hurts him to see me hurt. And that's been so valuable, just knowing that like my suffering isn't just like a thing to be explained or like to push beyond even, but like he'll sit with me and he'll help me and he'll then take that upon himself. And like God's compassion just like gave me so much hope in those moments. And I think another thing that a lot of people who've experienced difficulties with mental health have struggled with is fearing it and fearing that it will have the strength to overpower you or control you or determine the course of your life. And so yeah, knowing that God, who is like all powerful, who loves me, was fighting for me and was with me and knew how to bring me out of that dark place was just incredible. and kind of was what enabled me to start moving towards recovery, because like I knew it wasn't dependent on me. I think another thing I'd share in recovery is there can sometimes be a fear, almost like experience of being well, because you've got so used to your mind working a certain way and reacting to certain things with it kind of like that coping mechanism of like, I'll go down this thought pattern if it's too hard, or I'll do this to myself if I can't cope anymore. And actually moving beyond that and saying, I want to be free and I want to leave this behind, and I trust that I can do life without this when you've been used to it for a while, is challenging. And there's actually a story in the Bible where Jesus meets a man who's been unable to walk for 38 years. And he says, do you want to be well? And the man kind of deflects the question and is like, when people, there's a pool here and no one helps me into it. And Jesus meets him in that place and actually heals him and restores him and enables him to get up and walk and have a full life. And I remember just like God's gentleness with me being like, you can trust me. Like, you don't need to know how this is going to work out, but like, I will look after you in that freedom, and I'll show you how your mind can be healthy. And that was amazing. And when God, and it really was God, and nothing else worked, it really was God that like brought that freedom in my mind. Doing life with him and filled with his spirit and knowing his joy has been incredible, and just that reminder that I don't need to go back.
That's really wonderful to hear. Thank you so much for sharing, Anna. You also mentioned COVID, which I'm sure we're all aware of. Yeah, and we've heard recently on the news that the pandemic has caused lots of people to experience loneliness and mental health issues like anxiety, perhaps for the first time in their lives. Some of us are experiencing that personally. What advice would you give to Cambridge students who are experiencing these struggles, or who are caring for loved ones who are going through them?
Yeah, I think COVID has had a massive impact on people's mental health. I know for me, haven't like relapsed, which is fantastic, but I've definitely had more moments of struggle with fighting those kind of anxious and depressive thoughts, and bringing those to God and having to kind of deal with them more regularly and trusting him to keep me well and on the right track. So that's been a very real struggle. And I think for anyone who's experiencing that, has done before or for the first time, you don't need to be afraid. I think the amazing thing about knowing God is that he's so much bigger than coronavirus, and I can trust that no circumstance will overpower me if I'm walking with God. He'll always be looking after me, whether that's circumstances that are causing me to be anxious or things in my mind that are spiraling. He'll always, I've really known him kind of reach out and pick me up when I can't do that for myself. And so that I say, like, if you are struggling with mental health, or you know someone who is, my experience, like, the hope of Jesus is so much greater than any therapy or advice I've ever had, and he cares so much. And I think just going to that place and being like, okay, I've never tried this before, but Lord, I'm here, and if you're real and you're as good as these people say you are, can you help me in this? Can you meet me? And God loves to do that. And he cares for each one of us the same. And that verse I shared at the beginning about having a purpose, that's true of every single one of us. And like, God wants to show you how much you matter, because you're so valuable to him. So I'd really encourage you to speak to a friend maybe who's told you a bit about Jesus, or to try speaking to him for yourself.
That's really great, Anna. Thank you so much for sharing. I really enjoyed hearing and what you had to say and chatting with you. And I'm sure lots of people have found that really helpful.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much to Anna for sharing such a personal story with us. I'm Carrie, if you didn't catch that earlier, but anyway, Rebecca and I are now coming to you live from Cambridge and the other Cambridge. And so if you guys haven't submitted your questions yet to the Pigeonhole app, I think there were some difficulties with it earlier, but it should be working now. Maybe you can refresh the page
or else you can leave your questions in the YouTube comments. That should also work. But we have quite a few interesting ones which have come in already. And so let's see, the top voted one right now, it says, how do we know any of this is true? If it isn't actually true, then it doesn't matter how good it all seems.
Yeah, I completely agree. If it isn't true, it doesn't matter. To some extent, I mean, actually, psychological studies coming out of Harvard in the last few years have shown that people believing in religious truth actually makes them happier. So there's an extent to which, even if it isn't true, it will in fact improve our lives. But I think most of us in this virtual room today are interested in finding out the actual truth. My guess is you guys did get into Cambridge for not caring about truth and not caring about real intellectual engagement with questions. And I think it's very important to ask the question of the Christian faith in particular, is it true? I think that the best place to start in answering that question is to look at the person of Jesus Christ himself. And to start with that, you might read one of the Gospels, and you might think about whether the person that you are meeting on the pages of that book seems like he is who he says he is. Now, that seems sort of an oddly experiential way to go about deducing the truth of something, and it is. And you could take all sorts of other routes of looking at the historical evidence for the person of Jesus, and the leading scholars who would point you to that. You could look at the evidence for Christianity as the founding basis for modern science. This idea that there is a creator God who made all things actually turns out to be the foundation for what we now today call science, rather than the enemy of it. You could look at the philosophical and moral truths that Christianity has brought to us that we today take to be basic moral common sense, like the idea that all humans are fundamentally morally equal, or that men are equal to women, or that we should actually care about the suffering of those in other parts of the world, or in families or tribes or groups other than ours. All of these things have come to us from Christianity. So you could take that lens and compare, do the lens thing that I mentioned earlier of comparing Christianity to non-belief in God as an option there. And all of those might give you a framework of probability for considering this person of Jesus in particular. But as I say, the Christian faith stands or falls not on general belief in God, or even on whether Christianity sounds like a nice idea, but actually on the person of Jesus himself. So if you want to find out about the truth of Christianity, I recommend starting with Jesus.
Great. Yeah. So we have another question that's been voted up quite a bit, and it's on a slightly different kind of note. It says, what do I do when it's Christianity and Christians that cause me pain?
Yeah, another excellent question. And folks who've been a Christian for a while on this call will inevitably have experienced hurt from other Christians. And folks who haven't might well have heard about that from friends, or seen in the newspaper terrible things that Christians have done to Christians. That's absolutely true. And it's something that the Bible actually would have us expect. The Bible diagnoses that each of us has a huge moral problem, which in biblical terms is called sin. That we're not actually fundamentally good people, but we're fundamentally bad people who may, for sure, sometimes do good things, but actually we kind of have a moral rot at the core of our being. And one of the things that we expect as Christians is that we're going to continue to see the effects of that moral rot in our lives and in our communities for the rest of our lives. Now, this is, as we mentioned earlier, the heart of the Christian faith is this idea that Jesus actually died on the cross for our sins, to take the punishment for our sins away. But that doesn't mean that me today, for example, as someone who's been a Christian for decades of my life, that today I live without sin, that I don't continue to let my selfishness and my pride and my greed and my meanness and my jealousy and my envy and all those other sort of ugly things that come out from inside of me, that I don't let that impact other people. I do. And so I think we should expect, actually, sadly, that Christians will behave at times in sinful ways toward each other and towards those outside the church as well. To me, that points us actually to Jesus's beauty in contrast with our moral ugliness. And as I said, it's something that the Bible would have us expect of Christians, really.
Yeah, and I think it kind of ties in with one of the next talks that you're going to be giving us, where the question is whether faith is oppressive. So yeah, if somebody has a question that's kind of more on that line about historical things with Christianity and the church, that might be one that you want to tune into as well. We have another question here which asks, how do we know that God's suffering is intended for a purpose and that he's not just a sadistic dictator? Fairly strong words.
Yeah, this is actually a question, funnily enough, that was very much in the heart of, I'm sorry to mention the other place, but an Oxford professor in the last century, C.S. Lewis. You may be familiar with the Narnia stories from growing up or from seeing the films The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And he was someone who, like me, had done a lot of thinking and reading and writing and even speaking about suffering. And then he had the extraordinary and terrible experience of meeting a woman who he fell in love with late in his life, and discovering sort of right in the process of that she was dying of cancer. And one of the questions he asked himself as he watched his newly found beloved wife die was, is God just some sort of cruel lab master and we're just like the rats that he's experimenting on and enjoying our suffering? It was a question that very much was troubling and perplexing to him. I think, again, what we need to do if we're going to take the Christian faith on its own terms is look at the central story of Christianity, which is the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's easier for us to assume that if God really loves us, he wouldn't intend for us to suffer. But according to the Bible, Jesus is the person whom God of all humans ever has most loved. And he actually intended for Jesus to suffer the most. But not to leave him there, that actually the resurrection is part of the story as well, the coming through death and suffering to a life that is more glorious than it ever could have been before. This is the very center of the Christian faith, is that death and resurrection picture of Jesus before us. So I guess as I think about suffering in my own life or in the lives of others from a Christian perspective, the thing I always come back to is the God who made the universe is the same God, according to Christians, who died on the cross in the person of Jesus, who took that suffering on himself. And I can trust someone with my suffering who has suffered for me because I know that he loves me. I know that he loved me to the cross and back.
Yeah, I think what you said about how it centers around sort of Jesus' death and resurrection kind of ties in with this next question, which is sort of on a different tangent, but to what you said just now, how can we trust John's account? So how do we know, like, the story of Lazarus rising from the dead, did that actually happen?
Yeah, great question. I've been thinking about this quite a bit recently. I'm writing a book for Christmas next year. And one of the questions it's asking is, can we really trust the Gospels as historical accounts of Jesus' life? So for those who don't know, there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament, little biographies of Jesus, known generally as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And John's Gospel was actually the last to be written of the group. So Mark's Gospel, most scholars think, was the first, and John's Gospel was the last. And Mark's Gospel was probably written about 35 to 45 years after Jesus' death, which for most of us, honestly, sounds like a really long time to remember something. But if you talk to your parents or grandparents and ask them if they remember the significant events of their early life, things that happened to them 35, 45 years ago, my guess is that you'll soon find that they can remember the important things that happened very clearly. I was talking to my grandparents the other day about this, about the story of when my grandma gave birth to my mother. And it was fascinating to hear a story that they've told me when I was growing up that I'm hearing exactly the same now as they're in their 80s. And John's Gospel was written, as I say, the last of the Gospel accounts of Jesus' life. But according to New Testament scholar Richard Borkham, he's one of the leading scholars on these questions, wrote an incredible book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. According to him, he thinks that actually it was written by John, who was one of Jesus's disciples in his old age. He thinks the other Gospels are actually eyewitness accounts written down by someone else. So, for example, Mark's Gospel is Jesus' disciples Peter's memoirs, but written down by Mark. So it's like sort of dictating his his memories to his friend. But John's Gospel, he thinks, is written by John himself. Various ways we could look at the historical evidence for that. The Gospels were actually, as I say, written really quite close to the time of the events that they describe. And the reason for writing them down, it seems, was that the eyewitnesses were going to die out before long. So everybody wanted to make sure that the stories were written down accurately now. So, much more we could say on that, but just a little snapshot to say, actually, according to some of the leading scholars on these questions, we can trust John's Gospel because someone who actually watched these things happen wrote it.
Yeah, and I think we also have a book in our bookstall on the website. So it's called Can We Trust the Gospels? And it's written by another New Testament scholar. So I think if your questions are about the sort of historical reliability of all of these accounts and the things that Christians believe that Jesus really did and said when he walked the earth, then you can get yourself a copy of that book. You just have to kind of fill in a Google form, and we'll try to get one to you when we can. We have another question here which says, I believe we have no free will. And from what I understand, the theistic view is to trust your will to God's plan. Why is God the alternative to trust instead of, say, ourselves?
Sorry, did that question begin, I believe we have no free will, or I believe we have free will?
I believe we don't have free will.
Oh, no. Interesting. Okay, because there are two different angles actually in conversation with friends who are not Christians, and also reading some of the top thinkers from an atheist perspective. And there are some folks who would say would do a lot to want to protect the idea of human beings have free will. And then the other folks, like Sam Harris, for example, who wrote a famous atheist author over here in the States, he wrote a book called, I think it was called Free Will. And he said the idea that we as conscious beings have in any way responsible for our mental thoughts and subsequent actions is completely impossible to map onto reality. I'm slightly paraphrasing. But he's essentially saying, from a scientific perspective, as he sees it, there's no such thing as free will at all. Carrie, would you mind repeat? So that I was just picking on the first part of that question, and it's now made me forget what the rest of the question was. Do you mean repeating the second half? Because it was really interesting. I want to make sure I'm
yeah. So it says, from what I understand, the theistic view is that to trust your will to God's plan. So why is God the alternative that we're trusting instead of maybe ourselves?
Yeah. Well, within a theistic framework, and again, as I mentioned earlier, it's the framework that philosophically brought us modern science. Within a theistic framework, there is a God who made us, and therefore actually knows more about us than we know about ourselves. If there is such a being who created the entire universe, who knows more about the stars and the galaxies than any scientist has ever known, who knows more about the details of your life and of mine than any human being does. I personally would much rather that person was in charge of writing my story than I was just in charge of writing it myself. I think we have, especially in our kind of modern 21st century Western context, we have a very high value on our individual freedom. And we kind of hate the idea of anyone telling us what to do or defining us other than ourselves. But it's been fascinating to me to read up in modern psychology to find that actually, whereas having no freedom seems to be bad for humans in terms of their thriving, actually having completely unlimited freedom tends to work out not very well for us either. We work best when we are constrained by our community, by our sense of connectedness to others. And so to me, the idea that my life is actually part of a much bigger story, and it's not just sort of up to me to determine my own destiny, but I'm actually beloved of the one who made all of the world, who is writing the story of all of history and is writing my story as well. That actually feels exciting as well as comforting. I'm sure that doesn't answer all of the question there. But just as a glimpse from one Christian as she thinks about how we engage with this idea of free will and whether it's better to trust God or to trust ourselves.
Yeah, So the next question, I think it kind of ties in with maybe the idea that we were talking about earlier about how Christians can sometimes cause pain to other people. And so the question here is actually, what advice do you have for LGBTQ plus Christians who don't feel accepted in Christian spaces? And I understand that this is kind of a personal thing for you as well.
Yeah, very personal actually. Just to give you a little context on me, when I was a student at Cambridge, I remember going up to Cambridge after finishing at school and thinking, okay, bear with me because this was about 20 years ago, so you have to forgive the framework that I had at the time. I was thinking, hopefully now that I'm a proper grown-up going off to university, I'll start being interested in guys instead of girls. Because for as long as I can remember, I was always more attracted to girls. I consistently would fall in love with girls and not with guys. And I remember being really disappointed when I showed up at Trinity and in my very first term, fell in love with a girl again. Now, at the time, I wasn't talking to anybody about my feelings. And so it was something that I was just kind of living with. And it was something that as a Christian, I knew wasn't going to be something that I would follow through on. But I didn't actually have a clear understanding then of why that would be from the Bible, nor that actually being able to talk about my feelings with Christian friends would be a really helpful and productive thing. Now, there's no way in the very short period of time we have now I can kind of tell you all the ins and outs of how I thought through this theologically or even experientially. But what I can tell you today is that at the little church that I go to in my neighborhood here, some of my closest friends are also people who experience same-sex attraction, and it's a range. There's my friend Rachel, who became a Christian when she was an undergraduate at Yale University after her girlfriend broke up with her, having grown up in an atheist family and not having any interest in Christianity at all, but being sort of triggered by that, what felt like her life falling apart, honestly, this girl who she desperately loved, breaking up with her, and ending up becoming a follower of Jesus, and since then has been doing a lot of research and writing on these questions for herself. So I think of her, or I think of my friend Lou, who's a single guy who works as a therapist. He's always been attracted to other guys. And again, it's something that he talks openly about and we kind of openly connect on. So it deeply saddens me when LGBT people feel like they can't be welcomed and accepted in churches. At the same time, Jesus calls us, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, he calls us in following him to deny ourselves and to take up our cross and follow him. And one area where that will express itself for all of us, actually, whatever our patterns of attraction, will be in the area of sexuality. Because one of the weird things about Christianity, and it was weird in the first century just as it is now, actually, is this idea that we should have sex with at most one person. And that the God who made us does actually have the right to tell us how we should engage sexually with those around us. And to give you just a tiny glimpse, and again, I don't feel like I can cover it all, but a tiny glimpse of the logic for why the Bible actually gives us marriage as a man and a woman is because it's meant to tell the story of Jesus' love for his church, and that's a love across difference. And again, that's something that I, as a teenager, sort of wrestling with these questions for myself, didn't have any idea about, to be honest. But the Bible paints a picture in which actually human romantic love is intended to point us to a much greater love, and that's the love that Jesus has for us. So I think there's something beautiful there, but we tend to put, whatever our patterns of attraction, we tend to actually put too much weight on sexual and romantic relationships as if they are the ultimate thing, when in fact, if Christianity is true, they're not the ultimate thing, they're just a little signpost of the ultimate thing.
Yeah, and I was just wondering, this is kind of my own question off the back of it, I guess, because I mean, the question is about advice for, LGBTQ plus Christians who might not feel accepted, but would you have anything to say to other Christians who, so that they can better make LGBTQ plus Christians feel at home in whatever space they're in?
I think one of the most beautiful and compelling things to me about what the Bible teaches, honestly, is the way that it describes Christian community, how Christians should relate to each other. And it uses language that is embarrassingly intimate. The Bible talks about Christians as being one body together with each other. It talks about us being brothers and sisters. And Paul, who wrote much of the New Testament, calls his friend Onesimus his very heart. And imagine a guy saying that about a friend, like, you are my very heart. It's awkwardly intimate. Or he says he was among the Thessalonian Christians like a nursing mother with her children. And I've got 3 kids. Breastfeeding is one of the most sort of physically intimate things that you could do. So there's this picture of love between Christians, and actually primarily in biblical terms between Christians of the same sex, that I think as modern 21st century Western Christians, we sometimes lose sight of. And we sometimes buy into this idea that if you really want true intimacy, that's about sexual and romantic relationships, and any other kind of relationship is, second best. But actually in biblical terms, Jesus says a very interesting thing. He says, greater love has no one than this, that he laid on his life for his friends. And that's something which for me as a Christian who's always experienced same-sex attraction has been very meaningful to think. It's not that as a Christian I'm meant to not enjoy same-sex relationships. I'm actually meant to deeply enjoy same-sex relationships of absolute intimacy and love with sisters in Christ. But it's a different kind of intimacy than the kind that I would have with my husband, or that somebody could have, across a sexual relationship. So I think if the question is about how can Christians best welcome anyone, actually, whatever the patterns of attraction, I think it's being serious about what the Bible says about how we love one another. And in fact, Jesus said, this is how people know that you're followers of me, how you love each other.
Great, thanks. Well, the next question that we have says, do you differentiate between the treatment of mental and physical health? It says, we wouldn't pray and read a passage for a broken leg. So why should we expect a relationship with God to heal mental illness?
Yeah, great question. And something which my sense is that question comes from frustration at the ways in which Christians have at times neglected to use the many ways in which we could get help for people who are suffering from mental illness and mental health challenges, because they're only seeing it as a spiritual problem rather than as a potentially a sort of physiological, psychological problem. I think the way I'd slightly push back on the question, though, is to say, I think as Christians, we actually should be praying over a broken leg and reading the Bible over a broken leg and seeking the best medical attention that we can get. It's not actually an either or from a Christian perspective, because, again, one of the odd things about Christianity is that rather than promising that, one day our souls will sort of float off to a blissful, disembodied space called heaven, actually promises the resurrection of the body. And there's something very sort of visceral and physical about the Christian faith that cares about all of me and all of you, our bodies, our minds, our souls, all kind of packaged up together. So I think from a Christian perspective, to say we actually should pray over the broken leg, as well as seeking the best medical attention we can find. And we should pray over the experience of depression, or the experience of anxiety, or the experience of other psychological challenges, as well as getting the best mental health help we can get, whether it's from a trained therapist, or whether it's from prescribed medications that could help with that. I think it's actually I think it's a both end.
Yeah, and I guess there's a kind of underlying question, which is, should we expect that, if you're a Christian, you believe in stuff, and I think you mentioned something like this earlier, should we expect that these problems will go away, or there'll be less of them? That kind of thing.
Yeah. One of the things that it took me a really long time to even understand as a Christian, and I still every day have the challenge of truly believing it in my heart, is that the point of prayer from a Christian perspective is not to get the outcome that we're asking for. The point of prayer is actually our relationship with God. Let me just explain for a second how that relates to this. So we tend to see prayer as a little bit like a vending machine. You know, you put your coin of prayer in, and then you expect the answer to drop out like the chocolate bar out of the vending machine. And so we think that we pray in order to change our circumstances. And in that picture, Jesus is kind of a means to an end, honestly. But if we take seriously what Jesus says about himself, for example, in that passage I was quoting from earlier, if Jesus is the resurrection and the life, he's not the means to the end, he is the end. Now, that means that we absolutely should and must, if we're followers of Jesus, we must cry out to God in our pain and in our distress for his help. We can do that urgently, like Mary and Martha did, calling Jesus to help with the massive problem that they had. But it doesn't mean that Jesus will always necessarily fix our problem in the way that we expect him to. And another example of this from the Bible is Paul, who I mentioned, who wrote a lot of the New Testament. And he talks about a time when he prayed earnestly multiple times for God to take away something that he describes as a thorn in his flesh or a thorn in his side. And he doesn't ever define exactly what that is. So we don't know whether it was a physical ailment or it was a situation that he was in, but it was something really painful to him and very persistent. And he pleaded and pleaded and pleaded with God to take it away. God said no. The answer came back, my grace is enough for you, because my power is made perfect in weakness. So there's sometimes this misunderstanding people have, and that some Christians propagate, that, you know, if you really prayed hard enough, God would take your problems away. I actually don't think we see that in the scriptures. We certainly see God sometimes, even often, healing people and rescuing them from situations. But we also see multiple times a situation like Paul's, where he prayed and prayed and prayed, and God said, no, my grace is enough for you. So I think one of the first and last things that you have to learn as a Christian, and it'll take you all your life, is trusting God with your circumstances and praying to him earnestly in the midst of them, but knowing that he is actually the end and not the means to the end.
Yeah, I think we're coming to the end of our time, but I'll just squeeze in one more question. So we've talked a lot about suffering, and this question says, like, I understand why they're suffering according to Christians, but their question is, why the sheer amount? Like, there just seems to be so much. And they say, I just feel exhausted by the weight of it all. And that's probably something that a lot of people could relate to, especially during the pandemic and all the things we see around us. So I guess, what would you have to say to that? Yeah,
that's very real. And that sense of feeling the weight of it all and feeling honestly helpless in front of it. I don't know if this connects up with what the questioner is asking, but I sometimes have that sense that, you know, there are people around the world today who are starving. There are people around the world today who have been caught up in human trafficking and have been sold as sex slaves. There are children dying. There are terrible conflicts happening at both national levels and individual levels. And it's all more than I, as one little human, can even get my head around, let alone feel like I can make a real difference to it. So it can feel crushing and debilitating. And when I find myself in those moments, which I think in many ways it's actually a good place for us to care about the weight of suffering that's happening in the world, even beyond our own individual lives and spheres, I have to remind myself that I am not the savior of the world, but there's somebody else who is. And one of the beautiful truths of Christianity is that Jesus is the one who bears all of that. He is the one who is reaching out in the midst of all of that, not me. And yet at the same time, the Bible tells us that the church all over the world is Jesus's body on earth now. So it's not that the whole weight of suffering in the world is not my responsibility, it's Jesus's. And he is the person who died on the cross and experienced that suffering, is fully equipped to handle that. But actually, the primary way that he handles that in the world today is through his people. So all the suffering in the world doesn't fall on my shoulders, but I, as one of the billions of Christians around the world, need to play my little part in being Jesus's body on earth. So whether that means inviting a homeless friend over for a meal, or listening to a friend who's desperately heartbroken, or giving money so that people in another country can be provided for in their desperate need that I'm not able to physically meet myself, but maybe I have money that can help with that. In all those kinds of ways, Christians are called to be Jesus's body and meeting the needs of suffering people here today.
Well, thanks so much for all your answers, Rebecca. And thanks for everyone who sent in the questions or upvoted each other's questions. And this isn't the end yet. I have a few more things to say. So first of all, if this is a topic that you want to delve a little deeper into, we have a book on our bookstall, which is called Where is God in All the Suffering by Dr. Amy Orr Ewing. So if this would interest you, you can go there and order yourself a copy. It's all free. It's on us. And I can read a little short description here. It says, Dr. Amy Orr Ewing is no stranger to pain and gives a heartfelt yet academically rigorous examination of how different belief systems deal with the problem of pain. And so she'll go into things like injustice and natural disasters. And I think her conclusion is that the answer found in Christ is the one that can give us hope in our suffering. And secondly, our next event is coming up on Thursday with our other speaker, Pete, and he'll be going on with our little series in the common plot lines that we see in the world around us. And this will be on overcoming the monster. And there'll also be an interview with a Cambridge student and his experience of grief. So the title is The Story of a Cambridge Medic's Experience of Grief and Confronting All That Truly Terrifies Us. So we hope that you'll tune into that one, or else in a few more days' time, we'll have Rebecca with us again, and there'll be more opportunity for you to ask her your questions on the next topic. And the final thing is that coming up just in a few minutes at about 9:15, if you're on our website or our YouTube, you'll see the premiere of the Luke Experiment, which is a group of students who came together to sort of do a dramatic reading, radio play version to bring to life the first century biography of Jesus' life found in the Gospel of Luke. And so it's really interesting. You have different people voicing the characters. And then at the end, there's also a reaction podcast where one of the cast members brings a friend and they kind of chat about, their reaction to that. What did you think? Did you find anything strange or confusing? And so, yeah, give that a listen if you want to. And that's all for this evening. And hope that we'll see you here again at Story. Bye-bye.